Okay, well, maybe we might start then, and I'll just continue to let people into the meeting as they arrive. So welcome, everyone. Thanks a lot for being here. This is the third of the talks that has been organised in 2021 by the Sydney Uni staff group that supports the BDS campaign for Palestine Justice. My name's Nick Reamer, and I'm a academic at Sydney Uni, and I'm involved in that staff group. Before we get any further into this, I'd like to begin just by recognising that, like anyone in Australia, I'm speaking to you from stolen Aboriginal land. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders of that people, past and present. And particular respects to any First Nations people who are here or who will be listening to this meeting in the recording later. Obviously, if we support justice and Indigenous rights and self-determination and anti-racism in the case of Palestinian people, we have to also support it in the case of Indigenous Aboriginal people right here in Australia. And so the Palestine Solidarity Movement, I think in Australia, I think I can generalise by saying that it stands shoulder to shoulder with Aboriginal people in their fight against dispossession and racism and injustice. So for those of you who may not know, Sydney University has a group of staff members, both academic staff and professional staff, who organised to promote and support the campaign for Palestine Justice via Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions. We've been going for some years now. We organise various activities. This year, our main activity has been putting on this series of seminars, and we hope to announce one more seminar at least before the end of the year. You can, if you're interested, you can have a look at the list of staff on our website, staff at the University of Sydney who have pledged to uphold the institutional academic boycott of Israel. They're listed in the link that I've just put in the chat. And if you work at Sydney Uni and don't yet have your name there and would like to, please just get in touch with me and I'll be very happy to add you immediately. Well, look, today we're very lucky to have James Godfrey talking for us. James is a postgraduate researcher at Birkbeck at the University of London, and he's going to be talking to us about the current state of play of Palestine justice at English universities, particularly with reference, I think, to the PREVENT scheme, which is a special focus of his PhD research. The way this will run is that James, I think, is going to speak for about 40 or 45 minutes. That's right, isn't it, James? And then we'll have plenty of time at in the remaining part of the session for questions and discussion. So if you've got questions, you can do two things. You can either wait for the question period, or you can and ask them live, or you can just put them in the chat directly. And I will try and keep track of them. Maybe actually the best thing to do might be to put them in the chat once the question period starts, just so that they're all grouped together there in an easily visible way. James is going to be sharing his screen. This meeting is being recorded, and so it will be shared. It will be shared on Facebook afterwards. So if you're not comfortable about being recorded, you probably need to, make your name invisible or just not speak. I think the way this works is that only the speaker will turn up on the video, and it won't be possible for people to scan the gallery of participants, I don't think. But it's just as well that everybody should be aware that this talk is being recorded. So without further ado, then, I'll hand it over to James. James, as I said, is a PhD researcher at Birkbeck at University of London. We're very happy to have him here with us today because, as well as his academic work, he's a dedicated long-term campaigner for Palestine justice. He has lots to tell us, and I'm certainly really looking forward to both his talk and to the discussion that will follow it. So James, thanks very much for being here, and take it away.
Well, thanks, Nick, and welcome everybody, whether you're joining us live or perhaps many of you on catch-up. First of all, I acknowledge that I'm joining from unceded Ngambri, Ngunnawal and Ngarigo lands, otherwise known as Canberra in Australia. Yeah, it's another settler colony, just like Palestine. My respect to all First Nations people as well as to First Nations ancestors and the living for their historic and ongoing protection, nurture, education, and particularly relevant to this talk, resistance. I'm really pleased to be here to present on my PhD research into a particular legal duty and its impact on Palestine justice at universities in England. So why am I researching this topic, you might ask? Well, it's not necessarily to make me more employable, that's for sure. I sense a duty as a result of who I am and my various privileges, and something I hope we'll be able to reflect on throughout this talk. As Hutton Bazian's book title says, Palestine, it is something colonial. For the British, they've long sought control over Palestine for several reasons. Firstly, its strategic reasons over trade and natural resources. Secondly, the value it has for religious reasons, part of the Christian Holy Land, the Crusades. And in more recent times, thirdly, to attend to Europe's Jewish problem. And that's where me and my ancestors come in. Here are some of them. Refugees from European racism, pogroms in Russia. They managed to travel by boat to London about 120 years ago, just prior to the Aliens Act 1905, which was enacted to stop more people like them from coming. So, as a result of my mother being acknowledged as Jewish, I have the right to live in the settler colony which was Palestine, is now called Israel, and due to British occupation of this continent, I have the right to live here in this settler colony of Australia. So a little bit more about me. I grew up conscious of racism around me in London. I experienced some anti-Semitism or Judeophobia as part of a liberal Jewish community in London. I was brought up proper by my mum. Thanks, Mum. In particular, to oppose all forms of discrimination. Disappointingly, from an early age, I also encountered hypocrisy, racist slurs against non-Jews, Black and Asian people within the community, some of them my friends. My political development has occurred over 35 years of campaigning for justice and peace, including opposing British support for apartheid in South Africa and racism in Britain. In the last 10 years, I've focused on British and Australian support for Israeli apartheid, denial of Palestinian people's rights, including freedom of movement, an end to the occupation and the right of return. In particular, I've been organising with the Freedom Flotilla Coalition, freedomflotilla.org, which physically challenges the illegal Israeli blockade of 2 million Palestinian people in Gaza, and we try to reopen the only closed port in the Mediterranean Sea. This should have come with a warning. Now you've met my ancestors, let's head to London. Specifically, the School of Oriental and African Studies. An example here of both the chilling effects and the resistance taking place in universities. In 2017, the Jewish Society and the UN Society invited an apologist for the Israeli government, Mark Regev, former ambassador to Australia, who followed me, I think, to England. And at that stage, he'd recently been appointed ambassador to the United Kingdom. They invited him to campus to speak. He'd formerly been the chief spokesperson, you may recall, for the Israeli government during its massive murderous assault on the Palestinian people in Gaza in 2008. You probably recall him from being on the television. And there you see his tweet, and you see communications from the Registrar of SOAS explaining how it was vital for freedom of speech, freedom of debate, that he should be able to come and speak, the ambassador from the embassy, and they want to make sure the event takes place safely. And in the context of Prevent, which we'll cover more in this speech, it was important to defend the right of controversial speakers to come, as opposed to spokespeople from an embassy. So there it was, the students united against apartheid. Staff, students, trade unions got together and determined that they would protest, but also they would celebrate. Teach-outs, including resistance, when Mark Regev was due to come to the campus because the university determined he was coming. Here's the poster from the day. There were posters on bus stops all around SOAS. You may know it for those of you who've been in London or who are in London. Good morning to those joining us from London. These were the organisations which participated, all the various student organisations in particular. So it's a really good piece of intersectionality working out and building collaborations. Lots of police on campus, as you can see there. And here's the scene outside SOAS. I've got quite a few pictures from the day from my camera, and you'll see quite a crowd gathering. So Regev was in another building speaking. This was outside the main building. There was a celebration. Lots of flags. I'm going to take you to then. There's going to be a little bit of loud noise. So if you've got your speakers on loud, turn them down. We've got a quick speech and then a few other interventions.
Everybody together. You've brought everyone here from the cleaning strikes to the security who are on strike. I don't know if they're here with us. All of the students have given a lesson to management and to all of us here how to respond to the classic colonial model. That's the model that provokes and wants a reaction and wants us to be angry and shout. But what we do is we celebrate. We celebrate what we believe in, the universal values. What SOAS means to us, and by that way we unify, and this place belongs to all of us. So,
and here's some of the response to this kind of speech. And one more. Sorry if I should have given a warning about some of this file. Just the one more. So hopefully there you can get a flavour and you're in London at the moment. So the question really there is safe space. The university had said they wanted a safe space. They talked about the safety of events, the safety of students, the safety of speakers. But these words from a Palestinian student from SOAS saying they didn't feel the space was at all safe. There were these people with yellow flak jackets on, you can see them here, who had come down and they had security cameras and they were filming people and drawing attention the similarity between the way in which the Israeli government surveils Palestinians when they travel to Palestine, say for instance from England, if they're returning. So in England at the moment, you may be familiar with the hostile environment. This was brought up, and Theresa May determined that when she was Home Secretary to make people feel unsafe in Britain who are overstaying their welcome and overstaying their visas. She's determined to make a hostile environment. And so I've drawn upon that to what I call a hostile environment at universities around Palestine, and that forms the basis of my talk for today. I'll be looking at these few areas in the red and white, the issues of categorization of race, preemption risk counterterrorism, the prevent duty, the academy and the Israel lobby, and the effects all of that has on staff and students and organizations and the chilling effects it has. My research and writing is focused much on categorization and race, and focuses particularly on how particular words, particular things are stuck to people's bodies. And it can be the floating signifier around people. And there's a malleability with words, and the way in which the particular types of policies, types of racism are brought up to justify particular racist policies of a particular era. I think this ties in very well with what's happening about the topic of Palestine and those people who support Palestinian justice at universities, but not necessarily all of them. You'd be familiar with the front page rag tabloids. I don't need to show them anymore, but that's part of the context, mainstream media and the Islamophobia in Britain. The purpose of categorizing and targeting is key here, because not everything is targeted. It's, who exactly though is targeted? It's probably okay if you, hold a fundraisers for a children's charity, maybe a Palestinian food event. But to use Scott Ludlam's phrase from his recent book, it's intolerable dissent is not permissible. Permissible participation and protest for good immigrants and good Muslims, but you can't be criticizing Western foreign policy, as Aaron Kudnani refers to. So the focus is on attacking Muslim people if they advocate for Palestinian rights, or indeed anybody advocating for Palestinian rights. These are some of the interviews I've taken. I think all of these are some of the words throughout this presentation, a spectrum of people I've included in this presentation. So thank you to all of them for giving of their time and all the things which they do. And if there are any on the call today, thanks for being here. The way in which people describing as students, that they're feeling so frustrated and sad, feeling that they thought they were in a democracy and should be able to speak up, but then being attacked saying that Palestine doesn't exist, and people labeling people, people targeting people, and when on a Palestinian advocacy stall, people saying, "Oh, you're campaigning on Palestine," "Ooh," and this sort of synonymization with extremism and terrorism, which we'll obviously go a bit more onto here. So my research looks at preemption risk and counter-terrorism, counter-extremism, the way in which risk evolves from that being personal risk through industrial to catastrophic. You can read more about that through Professor Ulrich Beck's work. But I don't think if it takes account of race sufficiently in his work, and that's some of my academic writing, which we won't be talking about necessarily in this particular talk. I look though, what is interesting is the way science and staging, and in particular for preemption risk and counterterrorism, how the imagination, suspicion, fiction, and fear are used in order to draw upon pictures, visuals, memories of the past to then put them into paint pictures of things that may happen in the future to justify current actions which may limit your types of freedoms. And it's in that context within which the prevent duty, which we'll get to shortly, arises. We're focusing on counter-extremism. So that's when they talk about counter-terrorism, it's really around extremism, violent extremism, counter-terrorism. And there's this synonymization between all these phrases, which is key. Often these words will be interplayed. And so this happens within Australia too. This is from the Home Office Twitter account. So what is the prevent duty for those who don't know? The Counterterrorism and Security Act 2015, Part 5 of it, Chapter 1, Section 26, is a general duty on specified authorities. And it talks, this is literally the prevent duty, subsection 1. A specified authority must, in the exercise of its functions, have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. So key there to think of the words due regard. It doesn't mean must prevent, it says have due regard to the need to. So it's in that context that we'll move on. In the university, so in the university sector in England and Wales, although I'm focusing only on England here. Greetings to him from Wales who's joined us, because all of my interviews were actually carried out only in Wales. Separate story as to why is it not referred to Scotland or the North of Ireland. We can deal with that a bit later on if you'd like to. Anyway, the government has provided a range of guidances. Sometimes they've had to reissue the guidances as a result of legal action, and on how universities should implement PREVENT. So the duty applies to public authorities, and universities are one of the types of authorities. So it applies to all ranges of public sector agencies, including schools and the army, the fire brigade. But in this case, the hospitals, we're looking at the universities. Why am I looking at universities? Well, if we can't defend freedom of speech and about Palestine at universities, we're going to be struggling in other places. So I think it's a very important space for us to ensure that the PREVENT duty, which we'll go into a bit more detail, is dealt with in the university and removed from it. So it provides a range of these duties, but what exactly is different about this PREVENT duty from all of the other things which exist? Well, one, it's outsourced surveillance. So normally we'd have policing or security services who would be looking at these types of things about people being drawn towards terrorism. But here it's being given, the duties being passed to employees who are responsible for delivering public services. In this case, it's university staff. And the responsibility for enforcement, I've found through my research, as well as anecdotally, it seems to be often pushed down the chain to lower paid frontline workers. Secondly, it's extremely unclear about the duty because it conflicts with other statutory duties. Laws, it's just due regard, remember? So what systems should be put in place? What things should be flagged, prevented, reported? Thirdly, there's no judicial oversight, in contrast to other laws which exist. What are you basing it on? Well, maybe what we've seen in the news. Are they basing on what I look like, research-based evidence? Well, it's based on the extremist risk guidance, 22 indicators of extremism, which according to the conveyor belt theory they don't like to talk about, leads to terrorism. In this booklet, The Science of Pre-Crime, you'll find on the CAGE website, cage.ngo. If someone wants to pop it in the chat, maybe, you'll find it there. A thorough debunking analysis of the of PREVENT and the science of pre-crime, the science supposedly behind PREVENT. And when the Minister for Security and Immigration, James Brokenshire MP, he said during the second reading of the Counter-Terrorism Security Bill, although he didn't specifically mention these 22 factors, he did refer to factors and vulnerability when promoting the importance of PREVENT in ensuring frontline professionals identified issues. So that in his words, people are directed to support measures and do not progress down the path towards radicalisation and terrorism. That's that conveyor belt, isn't it, for you? See, underpinning PREVENT is supposedly science, which is why the reference to Beck, I think, was relevant to this topic. However, it's been extensively critiqued here. What are the thresholds? The bottom ones from the bottom quotations from a national students representative. You know, what are the thresholds for flagging people just when they join an ISOC in an Islamic Society, or if they join the Palestine Society, or if they go to a demo? The one above is from a young student, a Muslim female, Islamic Society chair for the north of England. Who's doing the judging? There have been some good leaks. We should look after the leakers. Some leaked documents here include a 24-page document, just one page for you here at the moment, which was produced by Counter-Terrorism Policing, as you'll see, in June 2019. It was used in several parts of the country as part of training for PREVENT. It lists, as you can see, some of the logos there, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, Sea Shepherd, but also the Palestine Solidarity Campaign circled there, Campaign Against the Arm Trade. Anti-police surveillance groups, all non-violent protest groups. It also, though, lists these alongside banned fascist group Combat 18 and the National Front. Not showing you their symbols. No promotion here. The guide was presented in briefings to public sector workers, and it was sent to doctors, NHS Trust, the National Health Service, schools and local safeguarding children boards. The last page of the accompanying document exhorts people to report any concerns identified via this particular document. So why is this important? Well, Universities are taking their lead on what to target from that sort of training, as well as from local police. And what are local police doing? Well, here's a document from Sussex Counterterrorism Local Police, which again was leaked from a few years ago. And it's talking about the priority themes and areas. And it's quite small, maybe you can't see it. So in case you're on your phone, it's focusing on protests, pro-Palestinian in the Brighton and Hove area, pro-Palestinian related protests in Crawley, and down the bottom, emerging issues, perceptions of prevent. The Academy and the Israel lobby. According to the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, the links at the bottom of the slide, universities have a significant investment in companies that are complicit in maintaining the Israeli crime of apartheid and other violations of international law. At last count, over £400 million worth. I wonder what the amount is in Australia. Maybe someone can put that in the chat. The Academy and the Israel lobby. The lobby, as people may have seen on the Al Jazeera programme, 4-part series from the UK, please check that one out. There's an extensive lobbying process within Britain, the United Kingdom, including the Lawyers for Israel, the Conservative Friends for Israel, who've just met at the Conservative Party conference in a filled-out room in Manchester, the Labour Friends of Israel. There's several Jewish newspapers as well, which repeat the Israeli government talking points ad nauseum and supported by the mainstream media and the right-wing commentariat magazines, as well as the Zionist Broadcasting Corporation. Sorry, the British Broadcasting Corporation. Talking of the Israel lobby in the European Union, David Miller, one of the co-authors of this book, we'll come to him later. The Israel lobby in the academy. A former paratrooper was appointed by the Israeli government through its Ministry of Strategic Affairs to lead the fight back on campuses against Palestinian solidarity organisations. And then you've got the pressure of the state. This is a letter from Joe Johnson MP writing to all universities protesting against Israeli apartheid, particularly Israeli Apartheid Week, under cover of anti-Semitism, this conflation between anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and opposition to the Israeli government and Israeli policies. All part of this is, of course, the attempt to redefine anti-Semitism and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA. A very straightforward definition of anti-Semitism. It's what I grew up with. It's what I've adhered to, I think, throughout my life when I was treated as Jewish. It seems quite reasonable. But a new definition has been brought up and is being pushed, which is, as you can see at the bottom, particularly focusing on criticisms targeting Israel and particularly looking at things to do with denying Jewish people their right to self-determination. No mention, of course, of the nation-state law which denies Palestinian people the right to self-determination, or the 61+ laws, discriminatory laws for Palestinian people living in so-called Israel, produced by Adala. You can't say that Israel's a racist endeavor either, apparently. The state of Israel is a racist endeavor. The most recent Secretary of State, I think he's still the Secretary of State for Housing, he's been pushing that all universities and local councils adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Not sure of the exact number to date of universities that have adopted it. Maybe someone can pop that in the chat if there's experts on the line. Sorry, just going backwards there. So this is part of the carrot and stick approach. So if you don't do it, adopt the IHRA. In the same way, if you don't carry out your prevent trainings, you're not going to get your funding. You won't be signed off, all sorts of things. So there's a lot of carrots and sticks going on here. So what's happening with this chilling effect on academic freedom? You see the government speaking to universities, pressures going down through student unions or through university departments, and then it's pushed down either in this case to student groups, according to this interviewee, but also to academics. The duty falls on the universities, and people lower down are affected. One of the key things from someone I interviewed was the issue of scandal avoidance. That now is a core business of universities, And they're actually not worried about trying to shut down a group of students, even if that compromises freedom of speech. They're far more concerned about the scandal avoidance, the threats from the lobby. There have been pushes by members of parliament, Jonathan Gullis MP, demanding that universities start sacking people, start sacking academics, and the chair of the Education Committee, the Minister for Universities again. So can you just mute that, someone, maybe? Thanks. So, and there we go. So they say, oh, universities are hiding behind employment law, failing to sack academics. Wow, what a timely talk I'm giving today. Why is the Israel lobby trying to sack David Miller, the author of that book I showed you before, and an expert in Islamophobia, and works with Spinwatch. So that's David Miller. He was attacked, pursued for months and months and months and months. And just this weekend, on Friday night, I think it was, he was fired by the University of Bristol. And thanks to Carlos Latouf, who always gets a timely cartoon ready for us for all events and purposes. So David Miller fired, lots of details there, and lots of details here at an upcoming event on the 10th of October, at a bad time for those in AEST, but may be useful around the world. Please sign up for it. There's details at the bottom of that slide there. As Professor David Miller sacked and lots of speakers. I noticed that Steve Salata is also speaking at that meeting, who people may or may not recall. We may get to him a bit later. The chilling effects on academic freedom occur for students who are organising meetings. Academics are organising meetings, and the way in which meetings are treated distinctly differently if they're about Palestinian solidarity. People being called into meetings at the last minute. You've got to have IDs, you've got to pre-register, all these sorts of things. Filled in the forms 2 weeks before and then told, oh, it's extreme Islamic, there's extra requirements, there's outside pressure. And then people coming to the ISOC events wanting to know names of who was attending, security coming to events. A picture there of Professor Richard Falk, his event at Middlesex University, one of the many events that have been cancelled during the Israeli apartheid weeks over the years. It's the former president of the NUS, National Union of Students, Zamzam Ibrahim, talking about how when she was president of the National Union of Students, how many cases there were that referred to, because they were usually members of the Palestinian Society or the Islamic Society. And a person I interviewed saying in the 21 months they'd been doing some advocacy around this, they dealt with more than 40 events. Another example I thought I'd share with you, if you missed that one, was what Cambridge University Labour Club. They expelled an Arab student at Cambridge. He wrote a critique of the IHRA working definition and was expelled. So hopefully lots of things you can follow up from here. I certainly don't want this to be a static meeting. They're making students self-censor in their academic studies. Students are then withdrawing from support services from the institutions. So much for making students feel safe. Students are now feeling unsafe in lectures and seminars as a result of potential academic referral. They don't even feel bloody safe, feel safe in their own accommodation. So students self-censoring. Cartoon there from Tim Sanders. But to then turn that image around, which I had at the beginning, what's the resistance to this hostile environment? I think it's important to us to identify our roles here and responsibilities, and that's what we'll turn to now. So the resistance come in many different ways. The resistance to the IHRA, most recently the Academic Board at the University College of London, it voted against adopting the IHRA definition, and there's lots of details on its website, the links at the bottom there, saying that the support of this definition will have a strange implication. Jewish students on campus will only be safe if the university uses a definition that explicitly identifies criticism of Israel among its core examples, thus impacting academic staff and students who might criticize Israel or research topics related to its status. So and the way in which it goes far beyond any actual experience of anti-Semitism reported by students. It reaches into matters affecting academic freedom rights and also the rights of Palestinian students and staff to characterize a state that they see as oppressing them as racist. So the fight back's happening. Oh, I couldn't help but put this in because we're in Australia now, aren't we? And there's resistance here against the Australian government, which is beginning to push this revised definition of the IHRA. You see Rob Harris's report in the news there, and then the response to it by APAN. So details there. Please check that out and chime in and throw support behind APAN's campaign on that one. There's some tools though, so you're not alone. There's a lot of writings around the IHRA and how to deal with it. And this is a useful toolkit which people may want to draw upon. And we'll be sharing the slides later on or uploading this later on so people will be able to track it. So don't worry too much if you haven't got it now. There's resistance though in forming coalitions. We talked about that earlier at SOAS, and whether it be the campaign against the arms trade, People and Planet, fossil-free investments. Often it might be those organizations which were labeled as there's organizations to be looking out for. Maybe go back to that one and maybe you should be contacting some of those groups on campus. And forming coalitions is key on the universities to try and resist this and to campaign for Palestine justice. And some of the best success have been where that's taken place. Resistance in the form of demonstrations. This is from the University of Manchester, demanding divestment now from war crimes. But you see on the right, there's a sign for border controls. No, not the one saying great coffee. Behind it, border controls. Protests at the University of Manchester, demonstration. Resistance, intervene, occupy. At Warwick University, they protested against a visiting Israeli former soldier. At Goldsmiths, they protested. They ended up occupying Deptford Town Hall for 137 days, Goldsmiths' anti-racist action. They were demanding safe decolonised universities, and they only gave up their occupation at Goldsmiths when they'd won extensive demands to combat institutional racism at the university. And it also brought to the campus what they said was, and the local community, a new force of anti-racist energy. Lots of links on there. At the bottom there, a couple of links, some boardroom interventions. I'm not playing them now. I posted them in the chat right at the beginning. So if you want to watch them, not now, but at your leisure, they're at the University of Manchester and King's College, London. They just don't fit so well on these sorts of presentations for our Facebook. So, other forms of resistance, refuse. According to this one Palestinian academic, said to me, excuse the French, fuck it. I'm not going to engage. How I respond to prevent? By countering it, by resisting it, by disengaging with it. Whenever there's a training about prevent, I don't go. So if prevent's brought in here or something like it, a lot of experience to draw upon. Not engage, disrupt, continue. Disruption, you can disrupt as a form of resistance. This group of students, one of them I spoke with, and they'd attended, found out there was prevent training at a campus they were at, and they found it out, looked through the window, checked out what was going on. They saw all these racist stereotypes, and they entered the room. They entered and they started asking questions, disrupted the training, and everyone got very annoyed. Speak up. According to one of the students, I indicated, I was determined, who does teaching, I was determined to continue at that pace. We were determined to maintain the standard we'd established. We're not going to shrink back now. And for another Palestinian academic, I think it was, I tried to talk more about Palestine. Of course, we're then having to think about how I frame it. I use the word Palestine, I use quotes from Palestinians and from their daily lives. It's already resistance and liberation. And the reference to Stephen Salater before he's in that right-hand book, We Will Not Be Silenced. You'll see details of what happened to Stephen Salater in the USA. Excellent book on the left-hand side, which Nick Reamer's got a superb chapter in Enforcing Silence. And in the middle, a wonderful book by Mark Lamont Hill and Mitchell Plitnick on Accept for Palestine, the case of exceptionalism around Palestine. Anyway, so what's next? It's important that staff members in universities open up spaces where they do the opposite of what Prevent does, because it functions enormously on silence and fear. And I think it's beholden on all of us as a collective community to refuse that and make it a public discussion. If you haven't signed it, if you're a scholar, grab the link at the bottom, signed the Palestine and Praxis Scholars for Palestinian Pledge, which I've signed proudly, and many others here have done too, that we're going to do more. We're going to center Palestine in our classrooms. In our research, we're actively going to include Palestine. We're going to commit to pressure our institutions to respect boycott, divestment, sanctions, support student activism, highlight Palestinian scholarship. I'm just going to play here. This is currently known as Azam Tamimi, a Palestinian British academic speaking with Miko Peled at the University College London in 2017. It goes for about 1 minute.
So many Muslims have been silenced. So many people like me have been barred from entering universities. I applied to a job, I cannot get it because I am a Palestinian and a defender of Palestinian rights. Things got worse over the past 15 years, but I'm optimistic that they will get better. And in order to get better, whether you are a Palestinian or not a Palestinian, if you believe in the justice, in the just cause of the Palestinians, you need to do something about this. And I commend you for having organized this function today, because, as I told you, I have not been invited to a university for more than 10 years now. And that's because of the pro-Israel lobby. The pro-Israel lobby uses all sorts of dirty tactics in order to prevent people from having an open, peaceful dialogue. I would recommend to you the documentary that Al Jazeera prepared. It's called The Lobby.
So what next? The London School of Economics, they're putting on a talk. Dr. Noura Erakat, the author of Justice for Some, talking about the anniversary of the UNGA resolution declaring Zionism a form of racism and racial discrimination. Putting the meetings on campus, dismantling the apartheid of our time. Free decolonised education from the streets of London, that picture. You know, many people have no choice about campaigning about Palestine, but I actually have a choice and I have privileges, as I told you at the beginning of this talk. I know of the injustices and the varying types of complicity that maintains them, and therefore I have to act for freedom, justice and equality. I'm sure there are many lessons for people here in Australian universities where such a preemptive prevent duty does not yet exist. I'm keen to work with you in resisting it and preventing it coming here. Thanks.